The second part, I want you to reduce the number of assumptions to critical assumptions and develop a validation plan. Now, how do we go from a whole list of assumptions to half a dozen critical assumptions? This is what I would like you to do. Take a look at the first dimension. What is the consequence if the answer to your assumption is wrong, and rate them on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being minor, 5 being grave. Then take the same assumption and rate on a second dimension, which is how confident are you that you know the answer to the assumption? Are you uncertain about the answer, or are you fairly certain? Again, on a 5-point scale. 1 means I am certain. 5 means it is a wild guess. Again, going back to my earlier point, this is another way of saying is, if you say something is a 5, wild guess, you're saying, I will never bet any salary that I know the answer to the assumption. If you say it is a 1, that means you're fairly certain. You're saying, I'm willing to bet 12 months of my salary, I know the answer to the assumption. So the two dimensions are, what is the consequence if the assumption proved to be wrong? Scale of 1 to 5. 1 being minor, 5 being grave. How confident are you that you know the answer to the assumption? 1 being quite confident, certain. 5 being wild guess. Then what I want you to do is to add the scores for these two dimensions. When you add the scores for these two dimensions, the minimum score you will get is 2. And the maximum score you will get is 10. Obviously, the higher the score, more is the criticality of that assumption. So pick the top 6, let us say, with the highest scores. Please note, even amongst the top 6, there may be a pecking order. Some assumptions are going to be more critical than others. Then what I want you to do is list the 6 assumptions, and then identify a low-cost experiment that you can do to test the assumption, and then identify the seed capital that you need to start the experiment. Seed capital is always staged. What that means is you should request seed capital for testing the most critical assumption first. So the number 1 critical assumption. Only after you resolve that will you get the seed capital for testing the second most critical assumption, and so on. What I have done is I have taken the New York Times Digital, and using New York Times Digital as an example, I have listed the critical assumptions. A critical assumption like, will the market grow? I have shown what would be a low-cost experiment that you can do to test that assumption. Say, monitor the penetration of the broadband connection. And then I've also indicated a seed capital, which is this will require very little resources. It's really a part-time job, a minimum part-time job for somebody to just monitor research in this area. So the second part of the assignment is to reduce the number of assumptions to half a dozen critical assumptions, and for each critical assumption, develop a validation plan, which includes low-cost experiment to test the assumption and what is the cost of that experiment, which is the seed capital you are requesting.